Imagine standing at the edge of a windswept cave in eastern Spain, the air thick with the scent of ancient earth, where the bones of our long-lost kin whisper stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about humanity's dawn. For years, we've painted our prehistoric ancestors as brutal survivors, their lives governed by a relentless credo: only the fittest endure. It's a tale we've told ourselves, drawn from the sharp edges of stone tools and the scattered remains of hunted beasts. But what if the truest measure of humanity isn't found in the strength of a hunter's arm or the gleam of a flint blade? What if the most profound discovery isn't gold, or temples, or even the fire that warmed their hearths, but something far more delicate, proof that compassion, care, and love are as old as our species itself? This is the story I want to share with you, a story that begins not with grand monuments, but with a tiny fragment of bone, no larger than a child's fist, that changes how we see ourselves. Let me take you back, far back, to a time when the world was wilder, harsher, and yet, as we're now learning, gentler than we ever imagined. Picture a Neanderthal family, huddled around a flickering fire in a cave they called home for a fleeting season. They were nomads, moving with the rhythm of the herds they hunted and the plants they gathered. Life was unforgiving, every day a gamble against starvation, predators, or the cold that clawed at their bones. In this world, survival demanded strength, cunning, and cooperation. Yet, among these rugged wanderers there was a child, a girl we've come to call Tina, who was different. Her skull, barely a few centimeters long, held clues that would rewrite our understanding of humanity. When scientists peered into her remains with the precision of modern technology, they found something astonishing. Tina had Down syndrome, a condition that would have marked her life with challenges we can scarcely imagine in such a brutal era. This discovery, unearthed from a cave called Covanagra, isn't just about one child. It's a window into a world where compassion wasn't a luxury but a necessity, woven into the fabric of existence. Tina's story begins in the Middle Paleolithic, a time when Neanderthals roamed Europe, their lives shaped by the rhythms of survival. Her tiny skull fragment, preserved through millennia, revealed abnormalities in her inner ear bones. Malformations that, after meticulous analysis, pointed unmistakably to Down syndrome. This wasn't a guess based on worn bones, as so many past studies had to rely on. Advanced CT scanning allowed researchers to see what was invisible to the naked eye, ruling out other conditions and confirming a diagnosis that would have been impossible just a decade ago. Tina, they estimated, lived to at least 6 years old, a remarkable feat in a world where every step was a struggle. Now, let's pause and consider what that means. 6 years old. In a Neanderthal band, where survival meant constant movement across rugged terrain, hunting with crude tools, and evading dangers that lurked in the shadows, a child like Tina would have faced extraordinary challenges. Down syndrome would have brought severe hearing loss, frequent vertigo that could send her reeling, and balance issues that made every uneven path a potential disaster. Imagine her trying to keep up as her family broke camp, the world spinning around her as vertigo struck, her family's calls muffled or silent. Walking across rocky ground would have been treacherous. Climbing a slope could have plunged her into disorientation. Yet, Tina didn't just survive. She lived, surrounded by a group that cared for her, protected her, and ensured she wasn't left behind. This wasn't a simple act of parental duty. Caring for Tina would have demanded the entire group's effort. Someone, perhaps her mother, perhaps an aunt or an older sibling, would have steadied her during long treks, holding her hand as the group moved through forests or across plains. Others would have taken on extra tasks, gathering food or building shelters, to free up time for those watching over her. This was a community effort, a collective choice to prioritize a child who couldn't contribute in the ways others could. Paleoanthropologist Mercedes Conde Valverde, who studied Tina's remains, points out that this level of care suggests something profound. True altruism. Not the kind born of obligation or expectation of reward, but a selfless act of ensuring one of their own was safe, fed, and included. This discovery forces us to rethink what we mean by humanity. We've long assumed that Neanderthals, our closest cousins, were defined by their brawn and survival instincts, their lives too harsh for softness. But Tina's story tells us otherwise. It tells us that even in a world of scarcity, where every resource was precious, these early humans chose to invest in someone who needed them. They didn't abandon her, didn't see her as a burden. Instead, they carried her, literally and figuratively, through a life that must have been as challenging for them as it was for her. This is where the story begins to shift, where the cold lens of survival gives way to something warmer, something that feels achingly familiar. As a historian of science, I find myself marveling at how this discovery came to be. It's not just the bones that tell the story, but the tools we've built to listen to them. For centuries, archaeologists could only guess at the lives of those whose remains they unearthed. A broken bone might suggest injury, a worn joint might hint at age. But the advent of ancient DNA analysis has changed everything. It's like opening a book that's been sealed for millennia, each page revealing secrets written in the language of genes. When researchers at the University of Adelaide and beyond began analyzing nearly 10,000 ancient remains, they weren't just looking for Down syndrome. They were looking for humanity itself. And they found it in the form of an extra chromosome, a genetic signature that spoke of care across the ages. But Tina's story is just the beginning. Let's travel forward to a time when our own species, Homo sapiens, began to leave their mark on the world. Picture a Neolithic tomb in Ireland, some 5,500 years ago, where a 6-month-old boy was laid to rest. His DNA, carefully extracted and analyzed, carried the unmistakable mark of Down syndrome. This wasn't a one-off. A massive study, published in Nature Communications in February 2024, screened thousands of ancient individuals and found 6 cases of Down syndrome and 1 of Edwards syndrome across prehistoric Europe. Each case was a thread in a larger tapestry, a story of communities that chose to care for those who needed it most. What strikes me as a writer is how these discoveries resonate beyond the science. They're not just data points or genetic markers. They're stories of people, of families, of choices made in the face of hardship. The boy in Ireland, the girl on the Greek island of Aina, buried with an elaborate necklace of 93 beads, the infants in Iron Age Spain laid to rest within homes, rather than cremated like their peers. These are glimpses into lives that were valued, not discarded. Each burial, each act of care, challenges the narrative we've clung to. That prehistoric life was a merciless struggle where only the strong survived. Instead, we see societies that made room for the vulnerable, that invested time and resources in those who couldn't repay them in kind. Let's linger on that Greek island for a moment, around 1300 BCI. The girl buried there, just 12 to 16 months old, was adorned with a necklace that must have taken hours, perhaps days, to craft. Glass paste, faience, carnelian, materials that spoke of trade, of skill, of intention. This wasn't a casual act. Someone chose to honor her in death, just as they likely cared for her in life. The beads weren't just decoration. They were a statement, a declaration that this child mattered. And in Iron Age Spain, where cremation was the norm, the decision to bury infants with Down syndrome in homes or significant buildings, surrounded by bronze rings and Mediterranean seashells, speaks to a cultural value we're only beginning to understand. As a historian, I'm struck by the consistency of this pattern across time and place. From Neanderthals to Neolithic farmers to Iron Age communities, the evidence points to a shared understanding that those born different were not to be cast aside. This wasn't about survival of the fittest. It was about survival of the kindest, the most cooperative, the most human. And as a writer, I can't help but feel a connection to these ancient people, their choices echoing across millennia, to remind us of what binds us together. So let's step back and ask, what does this mean for us today? These discoveries aren't just about the past, they're about who we are now. They challenge us to reconsider what we think we know about human nature. Compassion, it turns out, isn't a modern invention, born of philosophy or religion. It's older than our oldest stories, older than the written word. It's woven into our bones, our genes, our very being. And as we uncover more of these stories, as we peer deeper into the past with tools that grow sharper by the day, we're not just learning about our ancestors. We're learning about ourselves. Now, let's dive deeper into the science that made these revelations possible. Because the story of Tina and her kin isn't just about what we found. It's about how we found it. Science, at its heart, is a conversation with the unknown, a way of asking questions of the past and listening for answers in the fragments it leaves behind. For centuries, archaeologists relied on bones and artifacts to piece together the lives of our ancestors. A cracked femur might suggest a fall, a worn tooth might hint at diet. But bones can only tell us so much. They're silent on the invisible, the stories locked within the cells of those who came before us. That's where ancient DNA comes in, a tool that's revolutionized our understanding of prehistory as surely as the microscope transformed biology or the telescope opened the heavens. The breakthrough began with a simple but profound idea. What if we could read the genetic code of people who lived thousands, even tens of thousands, of years ago? DNA, that delicate spiral of life, doesn't survive easily. It degrades over time, broken down by heat, moisture, and the relentless march of millennia. But in the right conditions, cool, dry caves, or the frozen soils of ancient tombs, it can endure, waiting for us to find it. By the early 2000s, scientists had begun to crack the code, developing techniques to extract and sequence DNA from ancient remains. It was painstaking work, like trying to reassemble a book from a pile of charred pages. But with each advance, the past became clearer, its secrets less guarded. When researchers turned their attention to Down syndrome, they were looking for something specific, the genetic signature of an extra copy of chromosome 21. This condition, known as trisomy 21, creates a constellation of physical and developmental differences, some subtle, some profound, that would have been noticeable in prehistoric communities. In the past, archaeologists might have suspected a disability based on skeletal clues, but these were often ambiguous. A malformed bone could be the result of injury, disease, or something else entirely. DNA offered certainty, a way to confirm what bones could only suggest. And when scientists began screening nearly 10,000 ancient individuals, they found it. 6 cases of Down syndrome and 1 of Edwards syndrome, scattered across Europe, from Ireland to Spain to Greece. The oldest confirmed case comes from Ireland, around 3,500 BC, in a Neolithic tomb where a 6-month-old boy was buried. His DNA, carefully extracted from his remains, showed the telltale extra chromosome. This wasn't a fluke. The study, led by researchers from the University of Adelaide and the Max Planck Institute, was a monumental effort, published in Nature Communications in February 24. It wasn't just the numbers that mattered, though finding 7 cases of chromosomal conditions in such a vast sample was remarkable. It was what those numbers revealed about the people behind them. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern, a glimpse into how prehistoric societies responded to difference. Let's think about what this science means, not just as data, but as a story. Extracting DNA from ancient bones is like pulling a thread from a tapestry that's been buried for millennia. It requires precision, patience, and a kind of reverence for the lives you're touching across time. The process begins with a tiny sample, sometimes just a sliver of bone or a single tooth. In clean rooms designed to prevent contamination, scientists grind the sample into powder, dissolve it in chemicals, and coax the DNA out of its ancient hiding place. Then comes the sequencing, a process that reads the genetic code letter by letter, building a map of a person's genome. For Down syndrome, they're looking for that extra copy of chromosome 21, a small but significant deviation that marks a life lived differently. This isn't just about technology, it's about the questions we're asking. As a historian of science, I'm fascinated by how each new tool reshapes our understanding of the past. When X-rays were first used in archaeology, they revealed hidden fractures in bones, hinting at ancient injuries. CT scans took us further, showing the inner structures of skulls and limbs in 3 dimensions. But DNA is different. It's not just a snapshot of a moment, it's a story of a life, of a community, of a world. And when we find that extra chromosome in a child's remains, we're not just confirming a diagnosis. We're uncovering a human story, one that speaks of care, of connection, of choices made in the face of challenge. Consider the girl on the Greek island of Aina, buried around 1300 BC. Her necklace of 93 beads, glass paste, faience, carnelian, wasn't just a burial offering. It was a testament to her place in her community, a sign that she was cherished. The effort to craft such a necklace, to gather materials from distant places, suggests a society that valued her, not despite her differences, but because of who she was. And in Iron Age Spain, around 2,800 to 2,500 years ago, we see infants with Down syndrome buried not in cemeteries, but within homes, alongside bronze rings and seashells. These weren't random acts. They were deliberate, meaningful, a reflection of a culture that saw these children as special, perhaps even sacred. What I love about this as a writer is how it bridges the gap between science and story. The DNA tells us the what, the genetic condition, the age, the time period. But the burials, the artifacts, the care implied by a child's survival, these tell us the why. Why did these communities go to such lengths? Why did they choose to invest in those who needed them most? The science gives us the facts, but the story gives us the meaning. And together they paint a picture of a humanity that feels both ancient and timeless. This brings us to another layer of the story, the Neanderthals. Tina's case, with her malformed ear bones and her 6 years of life, is a reminder that compassion wasn't unique to our species. Neanderthals, often dismissed as brutish or primitive, were capable of extraordinary care. Their world was one of constant movement, where survival depended on the group's ability to hunt, gather, and stay one step ahead of danger. Yet they made room for a child who couldn't keep up, who needed constant support. This wasn't just about keeping her alive. It was about keeping her with them, part of their world, part of their story. As we move through time, we see this pattern repeat. The boy in Ireland, the girl in Greece, the infants in Spain, all of them were cared for, not just in life, but in death. Their burials weren't hasty or dismissive. They were thoughtful, intentional, filled with objects that carried meaning. This tells us something about the societies they lived in, about the values that shaped their choices. It's easy to imagine prehistoric life as a grim struggle, but these discoveries suggest something else, that even in the harshest times, people found ways to care, to connect, to create meaning. And that's where the science becomes more than just a tool. It becomes a mirror. It shows us that the impulse to care for the vulnerable isn't new. It's not a product of modern ethics or organized religion. It's something older, something that runs through our veins as surely as our DNA. As a historian, I see this as a turning point in how we understand our past. As a writer, I see it as a story that needs to be told, a story that reminds us of who we are and who we've always been. Let's step into the world of the Neanderthals for a moment, because Tina's story deserves more than a passing glance. Picture a landscape of jagged cliffs and dense forests, where small bands of Neanderthals moved like shadows, their lives tied to the rhythms of the seasons. They were hunters, gatherers, toolmakers, people who knew the land as intimately as we know our homes. But they were also more than that. They were families, communities, bound by ties we're only beginning to understand. Tina, the child from Kovanagra, is our guide into this world, her tiny skull fragment a key to unlocking a truth we've overlooked for too long. When researchers found Tina's remains, they weren't expecting to rewrite history. The fragment was small, unassuming, buried in a disturbed layer of a cave that had seen countless seasons pass. But when they used advanced CT scanning to peer inside, they found something extraordinary, abnormalities in her inner ear bones that pointed to Down syndrome. This wasn't a casual diagnosis. Scientists like Mercedes Conde Valverde spent years ruling out other possibilities, using a process called differential diagnosis to ensure their conclusions were sound. The malformations, unique in their combination, were unmistakable. Tina had Down syndrome, and she had lived to at least 6 years old in a world that demanded strength and mobility. Let's imagine what her life might have been like. Neanderthal groups were small, perhaps 10 to 30 people, moving constantly in search of food. They hunted deer, boar, and even mammoths, using spears tipped with sharpened stone. They gathered berries, roots, and nuts, their knowledge of the land passed down through generations. Every member of the group had a role: hunters, gatherers, toolmakers, caregivers. But Tina, with her hearing loss and vertigo, couldn't have filled those roles in the usual way. Her balance issues would have made walking difficult, especially on the uneven terrain of a prehistoric landscape. Her hearing loss would have isolated her from the sounds that kept the group safe: the rustle of a predator, the call of a scout. And yet, she survived, not for days or months, but for years. This tells us something profound about her community. Caring for Tina wasn't a simple task. It required constant attention, a willingness to slow down, to adapt. Someone, likely many someones, had to guide her during migrations, holding her steady as the group crossed rivers or climbed hills. When vertigo struck, someone had to be there to catch her, to keep her safe. This wasn't just about her parents. In a small group, every member would have felt the weight of her needs. Someone might have carried extra food to ensure she was fed. Others might have built shelters more carefully, knowing she needed protection from the elements. This was a collective effort, a choice to prioritize a child who couldn't contribute in the ways others could. As a historian of science, I'm struck by how this challenges our assumptions about Neanderthals. For too long, we've seen them as lesser, strong but simple, capable but crude. We focused on their tools, their hunting strategies, their survival. But Tina's story shows us another side, a capacity for care that mirrors our own. This wasn't about survival of the fittest. It was about survival of the group, and the group included everyone, even those who needed extra help. Paleoanthropologists like Conde Valverde argue that this suggests true altruism, a willingness to give without expecting anything in return. It's a humbling thought that our ancient cousins, living in a world so different from ours, shared this fundamental trait. But let's not stop with Tina. Her story is part of a larger pattern, one that stretches across species and time. When we move forward to our own species, Homo sapiens, we see the same thread of compassion woven through the ages. In Ireland, 5,500 years ago, a 6-month-old boy with Down syndrome was buried in a Neolithic tomb. His DNA, preserved through the millennia, confirmed his condition. In Greece, around 1300 BC, a young girl was laid to rest with a necklace that spoke of her community's care. And in Iron Age Spain, infants with Down syndrome were buried in homes, surrounded by artifacts that set them apart from the norm of cremation. These burials are more than archaeological curiosities. They're evidence of a mindset, a way of seeing the world that valued every member of the community. As a writer, I find myself drawn to the details, the beads on the necklace, the seashells in the graves, the choice to bury a child within the walls of a home. These are acts of love, of memory, of meaning. They tell us that these societies didn't just tolerate difference, they embraced it, celebrated it, made it part of their story. And as a historian, I can't help but marvel at the science that brought these stories to light. The CT scans that revealed Tina's ear bones, the DNA sequencing that confirmed Down syndrome in ancient remains. These are the tools of a new era in archaeology. They allow us to see beyond the surface, to hear the voices of those who've been silent for millennia. But they also remind us of the limits of our knowledge. For every question we answer, 10 more arise. Why do we see so many cases in Iron Age Spain? Is it a matter of preservation, or methodology, or something deeper? What about those who lived beyond infancy? Where are their stories? These are the mysteries that keep researchers awake at night, and they're the questions that make this story so compelling. What I love about this, as both a writer and a historian, is how it connects us to the past. Tina's community, the Neolithic farmers, the Iron Age villagers, they're not so different from us. They faced challenges we can barely imagine, yet they found ways to care, to include, to love. Their story is our story, a reminder that compassion isn't a modern invention, but a thread that runs through the heart of humanity. Let's turn now to the burials, because they're where the story of prehistoric compassion comes into sharpest focus. There's something deeply moving about the way a community chooses to say goodbye, the way they honor those they've lost. In the case of individuals with Down syndrome, these burials aren't just rituals. They're statements, declarations of value that echo across millennia. From Ireland to Greece to Spain, the evidence paints a picture of societies that didn't just care for their vulnerable in life, but remembered them in death with a tenderness that takes my breath away. Start with the girl on the Greek island of Aina, buried around 1300 BCI. She was young, just 12 to 16 months old, yet her community chose to adorn her with a necklace of 93 beads. Glass paste, fans, carnelian. Picture the hands that strung those beads, the care that went into choosing each one. These weren't simple trinkets. Carnelian, with its warm red glow, might have come from distant lands traded across seas. Faience, a kind of early glass, required skill to craft. This necklace wasn't just a gift for the afterlife. It was a testament to her place in the community, a sign that she was seen, known, loved. Now let's travel to Iron Age Spain, around 2,800 to 2,500 years ago. Here, in the region of Navarra, archaeologists found something even more striking. Infants with Down syndrome buried not in cemeteries, but within homes or significant buildings. This was a time when cremation was the norm, the standard way to send the dead to whatever came next. But these children were different. They were laid to rest with care, surrounded by bronze rings and Mediterranean seashells. These objects weren't just decorations, they were symbols, perhaps of protection, perhaps of status, perhaps of something we can't fully grasp. What's clear is that these burials were deliberate, meaningful, a choice to set these children apart. As a writer, I find myself lingering on these details, imagining the hands that placed those seashells, the voices that spoke over those graves. These weren't hasty burials, rushed through to move on with life. They were acts of remembrance, of love that extended beyond death. And as a historian, I'm struck by the consistency of this pattern across cultures and time periods. From the Neolithic tomb in Ireland to the Bronze Age grave in Greece to the Iron Age homes in Spain, we see the same impulse: to honor, to care, to make space for those who were different. This raises questions that archaeology is only beginning to answer. Why these special burials? What did they mean to the people who performed them? In Iron Age Spain, where cremation was standard, why choose burial for these infants? Researchers from the University of Barcelona suggest that these children held particular significance, perhaps seen as special in a cultural or spiritual sense. The seashells, the bronze rings, these were objects of value, not given lightly. They suggest a belief system that saw these children as more than just vulnerable members of the group. Perhaps they were seen as intermediaries, as bearers of some deeper meaning we can only guess at. This pattern isn't unique to Down syndrome. Across prehistory, we see evidence of care for individuals with other conditions: dwarfism, hydrocephalus, spina bifida, ... Take the Romito, two individual in Italy, around 11,000 years ago, a young adult with severe dwarfism who lived to 17 or 20 years old. That kind of survival, in a world where mobility and strength were critical, points to a community that went to great lengths to support him. Or the Kafse 12 child in Israel, around 95,000 years ago, with hydrocephalus, who lived to about 3 years old. These cases aren't anomalies. They're part of a broader picture of prehistoric care, a willingness to invest in those who needed it most. What's fascinating, as a historian, is how these discoveries challenge our assumptions about prehistoric priorities. We've long imagined early societies as focused solely on survival, discarding anyone who couldn't keep up. But these burials, these acts of care, tell a different story. They suggest a world where resources, time, food, energy, were shared with those who couldn't contribute in traditional ways. This wasn't about pragmatism. It was about values, about a shared understanding of what it means to be human. As a writer, I can't help but see these burials as stories, each one a chapter in a larger narrative. The necklace in Greece, the seashells in Spain, the tomb in Ireland. They're not just artifacts. They're expressions of grief, of love, of a community's refusal to let their most vulnerable fade into obscurity. And as a historian of science, I'm in awe of how we've uncovered these stories. The DNA analysis that confirmed Down syndrome, the careful excavation that preserved those beads and shells, these are the tools that let us hear the past as whispers. But they also remind us of how much we still don't know. Why these particular rituals? What did they mean to the people who performed them? These are questions that linger, pulling us deeper into the mystery. And that's what makes this story so compelling. It's not finished. Each discovery, each new set of remains, adds another piece to the puzzle. We're not just learning about the past, we're learning about ourselves, about the roots of our capacity to care. These burials, these acts of compassion, are a reminder that humanity has always been more than survival. It's been about connection, about making space for everyone, no matter how different. Now let's bring this story full circle, because what we're uncovering here isn't just about the past. It's about who we are and who we've always been. As a writer, I want to paint you a picture of a world that feels both distant and intimately familiar. A world where compassion wasn't a luxury, but a cornerstone of existence. As a historian of science, I want to show you how these discoveries are reshaping our understanding of human nature, challenging narratives we've held for too long. Why? Corky. And as someone who loves a good story, I want to leave you with a sense of wonder, of connection to those who came before us. Let's start with the big picture. These discoveries, Tina's skull, the boy in Ireland, the girl in Greece, the infants in Spain, are more than isolated cases. They're part of a growing body of evidence that prehistoric societies, from Neanderthals to early Homo sapiens, made deliberate choices to care for their most vulnerable. This wasn't about survival of the fittest, as we've so often assumed. It was about survival of the group, and the group included everyone. The child with Down syndrome, the young adult with dwarfism, the toddler with hydrocephalus. They weren't cast aside. They were carried, supported, remembered. This challenges everything we thought we knew about prehistory. We've long imagined early humans as driven by necessity, their lives a constant battle against a hostile world. But these stories tell us something different. They tell us that even in the harshest times, people found ways to care. They shared food, time, and energy with those who needed it most. They crafted necklaces, buried their dead with seashells, chose homes over cemeteries. These were acts of love, of meaning, of humanity. And they weren't confined to one time or place. They stretched across millennia, from the caves of Neanderthals to the villages of the Iron Age. As a historian, I'm struck by how these findings align with other evidence of prehistoric care. The Romito II individual, with his severe dwarfism, lived to young adulthood in Italy, 11,000 years ago. The Kavze 12 child, with hydrocephalus, survived to 3 years old in Israel 95,000 years ago. These cases, like those of Down syndrome, point to a level of cooperation that went beyond immediate family. Caring for someone with significant disabilities required the whole group to adapt, hunters taking on extra tasks, gatherers sharing their haul, caregivers watching over those who couldn't keep up. This wasn't about obligation, it was about a shared understanding of what it means to belong. But every answer in archaeology raises new questions, and these discoveries are no exception. Why do we see a concentration of Down syndrome cases in Iron Age Spain? Is it a matter of better preservation, more thorough excavations, or something deeper? Perhaps a cultural practice we don't yet understand. Why do the DNA records show mostly infants and young children? Are there older individuals with Down syndrome waiting to be found? Their stories locked in untested remains. And perhaps most intriguingly, how did these communities adapt their daily lives to include those with significant disabilities? What social structures, what beliefs, allowed them to prioritize care in a world where survival was never guaranteed? These questions aren't just academic, they're deeply human. They push us to think about how we define community, how we value difference, how we care for those who need us. As a writer, I find myself imagining the daily rhythms of these ancient lives. Picture a Neanderthal band pausing their trek to steady Tina as she wobbles on uneven ground. Imagine a Bronze Age family stringing beads for a child they know won't live long, pouring their love into every knot. These are the moments that define us, the choices that make us human. And as a historian, I'm reminded that science doesn't just uncover facts. It uncovers stories, connections that bridge the gap between then and now. What's most remarkable to me is how these discoveries challenge our modern assumptions. We like to think of compassion as a recent invention, a product of civilization, of philosophy, of religion. But these stories tell us otherwise. Compassion is ancient, older than our oldest cities, older than our written words. It's woven into our DNA, as much a part of us as our ability to hunt or build or dream. When we look at Tina, surviving 6 years in a Neanderthal world, or the infants in Spain, buried with care in their homes, we're seeing the roots of our own capacity to care. We're seeing ourselves. This brings us to the science that made it all possible, because without it, these stories would still be silent. Ancient DNA analysis, CT scanning, the meticulous work of archaeologists and geneticists, these are the tools that let us hear the past. But they're also a reminder of how much we still have to learn. Each new site, each new sample, adds another piece to the puzzle. And as our tools grow sharper, as our questions grow bolder, we'll uncover more of these stories, more of these glimpses into the heart of humanity. So, what does this mean for us today? As a writer, I want to leave you with a sense of connection, a feeling that these ancient people are not so different from us. Their world was harsher, their lives shorter, but their choices, to care, to include, to remember, echo in our own. As a historian, I want to remind you that the past is never truly gone. It lives in the bones we unearth, the genes we sequence, the stories we tell. And as someone who loves a good story, I want to leave you with Tina, the Neanderthal child who lived 6 years in a world that could have cast her aside, but chose instead to carry her. Her story, and the stories of those like her, are a testament to something timeless, that love and compassion are as old as humanity itself.